That's one of the beautiful things about real estate. I think it was Cameron Herold who said this initially, but you practice R&D. In corporate world, that's research and development. Well, in real estate, it's rip off and duplicate. Just find somebody who's already successful at what you want to do, and just learn and copy what they do and go execute. And that was the beauty of it. So that was one of the main reasons we were able to persist, is we knew it would work if we persisted.
Investing in syndications can be a daunting task. Wiring a large sum of your hard-earned money to someone you talk to on the phone for 30 minutes can certainly be scary. How can you be confident in what you are doing? Steve Sue, one of the founders of LFI, just published a book called Avoiding Rookie Errors as a Left Field Investor, 20 Lessons Learned from 14 Years of Passive Investing in Private Syndications. This is the best passive investing book I've read. It's easy to read. It's chock full of great advice from Steve's experience as a passive investor. Whether you're a first-time passive investor or a veteran, you can learn from these lessons. You got to read this book. Get the link to Avoiding Rookie Errors as a Left Field Investor on our website today at www.leftfieldinvestors.com. Hello, left fielders. Welcome to the Passive Investing from Left Field podcast. Our community is focused on networking and education to help people invest passively and think differently. Let's go. I'm really excited today to have Andrew Cushman with us. He is the founder and principal of Vantage Point Acquisitions. It's a firm focused on multifamily apartments, mainly in the Southeast. Andrew is a former chemical engineer who found real estate in 2007 and left his corporate position to start a business in real estate, starting off by flipping single-family properties in Southern California, transitioning to multifamily acquisitions, which he does now, and as he's successfully syndicated and repositioned over 2,600 multifamily units. Andrew, welcome to the Passive Investing from Left Field podcast.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Good to be here.
Well, it's been a long time coming because I know I've kind of canceled on you a couple of times. I appreciate your patience getting into it. The first thing I want to ask is if you can tell us about your journey. How did you get into real estate? I know you went from flipping houses to syndication, but how did you make that whole transition? So kind of start at the beginning and lead us through your journey.
Yeah, like half the people in real estate, I got an engineering degree in order to get into the real estate business. The reason for that was when I was a kid, I was very entrepreneurial, just out like mowing people's grass and trying to whatever I could do to make money. I always knew I wanted to own my own business, but I didn't know how. So I figured, well, if I get an engineering degree, I at least have a good job, good income, and I can tolerate it until I figure out what I'm going to do. So I met and married my wife, who had the same kind of mindset. And we tried all kinds of little businesses, vending and flipping cars and all this stuff. And every one of them was like, okay, this is either going to take really long time to scale, or it's just going to be another job. And I mean, we made a little bit of money each time, but nothing really seemed like, okay, this is it. And then in 2006, we discovered flipping houses. And Southern California, great place to flip houses, tons of equity here. And so we said, all right, this is something we think we can do. And at the time, the way to do that was we were cold calling people who were in pre-foreclosure. So they'd stopped paying their mortgage, and the lender had said, hey, we're going to take the house in 90 days if you don't do something. And so as an engineer who wasn't the strongest at communication, I found out later when my wife would call me when we were dating, she would make a list to keep the conversation going because I was so bad at like actually talking. And this was somebody I was really interested in, right? So what do? Yeah. I go into a business that depends on me cold calling strangers and saying, hey, let's talk about your financial problems, right? I mean, they're not exactly excited about my call. So it took me 4,576 phone calls to get our first deal. However, when we flipped that first deal, it was a condo, we made as much money as I made all year at my engineering job. And we said, okay, this is it. So I quit and my engineering job went full-time into flipping. My wife joined me 2 years later full-time. We flipped for a few years. It was great. We made good money, but we realized, okay, this is also kind of another job. And the way we had built it, it all depended on us. And we said, well, 2009, 2010 were really good years. And we said, well, what what's the next big thing? And then what scales really well? And we reasoned that, okay, we just had a huge recession, which means we're probably going to have a long expansion, which means job creation, household formation, etc. And everybody and their mother either got foreclosed on and can't buy a house for the next 7 years, or knows somebody who got foreclosed on and is scared to buy a house for the next 7 years. So that means there's going to be a ton of people entering the rental pool. Let's go figure out apartments. So we found a mentor, hired the guy. He held our hand through our first deal, which was 92 units on the other side of the country in Macon, Georgia. And that was 2011. We went into apartment syndication full time. So I guess we've been doing it full time for 12 years now, a little over 2,700 units. And it's been a fantastic journey and a fantastic business. So,
well, that's a great story. And I want to circle back 4,576 calls.
Yeah.
How do you not get discouraged? How do you make I get it. You make the first call, you make the 100th call, maybe you even make the 1,000th call. But how do you know that how do you keep going? What was in it?
Yeah, I did get discouraged. You're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. However, my wife and I really believe that this was probably going to be our best shot at a successful business. And that's a good question. Like, well, because I say one of my superpowers is relentless persistence. Like, just go until I make it happen. However, the flip side of that is there is a point where quitting makes sense because you're doing something that doesn't work or that is wrong or whatever. Well, we knew other people that were successfully flipping. And so we knew that there wasn't anything wrong with the system or the asset. What needed to be worked on was me. And I can work on that. That's something I can control. So it was just a matter of if I learn to do this, if I learn to execute, it will work. So that, and then of course I had my wife, supporting me and we were working together. And, I'd get off the phone. She would sit there and listen and I'd get off the phone and she'd be like, okay, honey, that was good, but maybe next time say it this way, Right. So she was like my in-house coach. So it was just that, the number one, the desire and the drive to make it happen, but then also knowing that we were working on a proven system. It wasn't just some idea that we had for an app and maybe people like it, maybe they don't. That's one of the beautiful things about real estate. I think it was Cameron Herold who said this initially, but you practice R&D. In corporate world, that's research and development. Well, in real estate, it's rip off and duplicate. Just find somebody who's already successful at what you want to do and just learn and copy what they do and go execute. And that was the beauty of it. So that was one of the main reasons we were able to persist, is we knew it would work if we persisted.
Right. I love that because what it also shows, we talk a lot in Left Field Investors about the power of community. And, network community, it's the same thing. And your network, you had exposure to people who are successful at this. So you knew it wasn't this, it was you, and you needed to improve yourself to be successful. And it's the same with passive investing, right? We have a community of LP investors, and they can look at other people and say, okay, I know this can work because, we just saw one of our founders, Chad Ackerman, he quit his W-2 and he's a full-time passive investor now, and he did it in 5 years. So you see that and you're like, okay, I can do that. And that's similar to what you did. Then the question is, okay, you finally, after the 4,577th call was the successful one. You did the flip and then you said, I'm out, I'm quitting my job. So my next question is, how did you know you could replicate that without doing another 4,500 calls enough so that you quit your job? It seems like you might have quit your job maybe after you do 2 or 3 deals to confirm it works, but you did it after one.
Yeah, I didn't know actually. And I think it took another 2,000 or 3,000 phone calls because it was 6 months until the next deal. However, so there was definitely some uncertainty there. But what we did is, again, I made that one flip. I made my entire year's salary. So I said, worst case scenario, I do this for a year. It doesn't work. I go back to my job. I made sure I left on very good terms. So that,
okay.
And that's what we reasoned. What is the greatest downside? Well, I'll just go back to where I was. What's the upside? Unlimited. So we made sure that we took those proceeds and set that aside. My wife kept her job for 2 more years. So that at least we still had some income. And we said, this is our chance to go for it. So we did it once and we said, okay, this works. we just had 6 months of practice, so hopefully it won't take us 4,500 something calls again.
Right.
It took us more than I hoped, but we eventually got there.
Well, that's a great story. And then you decided, I mean, the analysis you did to figure out, hey, apartments might be the next thing is great. I mean, that's seeing into the future, right? So great job on that. And then how did you get the courage? I mean, obviously you have courage. You did one flip and said, I'm out from your W-2, right? So obviously you have the courage, but your first deal, 92 units, all not halfway across the country, all the way across the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
My first multifamily deal was 22 units, and that was biting off way more than I could chew. So how did you then get the courage to say, all right, we're going to do a 92 unit apartment, and just to make it harder, we'll do it in Georgia?
Well, I think it was a combination of being naive and the broker saw a sucker coming from a mile away, particularly California sucker, right? No, I mean, it was, we had already kind of, in a sense, made that transition once, jumped from engineering to flipping houses successfully. And it's not a direct correlation, but there's certainly certain aspects of it's still real estate. There's renovations. There's certain systems that you learn. You're working with contractors. You're working with private investors. So it is definitely a different business in multifamily, but there's some correlation. And then second, like I said, we hired a mentor before we got into flipping houses. I think that's a little bit easier for people to kind of figure out on their own. Multifamily, especially big stuff, is an entirely different animal. That it's not just real estate; it's a business, and that business comes with people and and all kinds of other aspects. And so, like I said, we had a mentor who had already done about 800 units. And a great guy. We ended up partnering and doing like 6 deals together. We're still in business together today, 12 years later. But he held our hand and guided us through that whole process. And that was a huge part of it. Well, we would have never have done that if it was just my wife and I being like, hey, let's go do apartments. Absolutely not. So there's that mentor.
And so, yeah, and mentors help, right? And again, I don't mean to keep going back to our community, but that's our community is like one mentor, right? You join it, then there's a bunch of people you can learn from. And it sounds like you took advantage of that opportunity. And then you partner with that person for 12 years. So that's really building a relationship. So did that first syndication, that first deal you did, how did that turn out?
It was profitable, but it definitely did not go to plan. This was 2011. So we were still bumping along the bottom of the results of the great financial crisis. So that 92 units was 75% vacant, built in the 60s and early 70s and in a low income part of town, right? Stuff that we would never, ever touch now. Like we don't do that kind of stuff. I got a saying that, C properties tend to look really good on paper, but they almost never work out that way in real life. So like I'm actually get a t-shirt made. I like to say the grass is always greener over the septic tank, right? Like there's a reason they look good on paper and there's a reason that there's less competition to buy them. Again, but there was massive upside to it. That experience is part of what shaped who we are today, both what we do and what we don't do. We ended up selling it for like 3 times what we paid for it. But in the meantime, the renovation went way over because it was built in the 60s and neglected for 15 years. So as you're doing renovations, it's like peeling off the layers of a rotten onion. This layer is bad. Let's get rid of it. Oh, the one underneath is even worse. We'd repair stuff and vandals would come in and rip out the copper piping and not even bother to turn off the water. So $50,000 of damage from that. Right. And again, I don't regret doing it because I probably wouldn't be sitting here having the conversation with you today if we hadn't taken the leap and done it. But it made us realize like, okay, we got to do a better job of creating systems for, estimating and managing renovations and, making sure we're in, areas where the income is high enough to support, elevated rents and in an area where crime is not going to be a problem and just, all the many things we do for screening today. So again, it was successful in terms of it did not hit our pro. I think our pro forma was like a 35% IRR, right? Again, see properties on an Excel spreadsheet, right? Looks great. I think our actual was closer to 20 something, but it's again, I don't regret it, but it definitely didn't go to plan. And, but we learned and adapted, and, a lot of, where we are today is because we took the leap and did that. But that's also part of why I'm pretty gray these days. So.
Yeah, those C-class properties are complicated. I mean, what did you do after that? Was that the worst or the most complicated deal you have done, or was it all gravy after that?
Definitely not all gravy after that. So we learned some lessons. We didn't learn quite enough. So the next two deals were a step up. I'd call C plus. Those ended up being home runs. Then they were also in Georgia. Then we expanded to Dallas. And this was the next the property I'm about to tell you about is the worst syndication we've ever done. We've done 20 something syndications, a little over 2,700 units. This is the worst one we've ever done. We bought in and this was the property that the last one before we formally created our screening process. We bought a C-class property built in 1974. In a rough part of South Dallas, huge property, 350 units. Again, lots of deferred maintenance, a chiller system, which means there's one giant air conditioning that runs the entire thing. So guess what? When it's August in Dallas and the chiller system goes down, you don't have one angry, hot, sweaty resident. You have 350. and if it goes for more than a few hours, you're on the evening news. So we bought a very rough property in a rough part of Dallas, and we started doing the renovations, and we got the rent bumps that we wanted, and we're like, okay, heck, this is actually going pretty well. But what happened is the demographics there were so bad that we'd renovate a unit, we'd release it for a significant amount more. Someone would move in 6 months later, despite our screening. They would stop paying rent. When they finally got evicted, they would destroy the unit on the way out. And it wasn't just a quick paint and turn. We had to renovate it again every time. Never mind the ongoing maintenance from pipes breaking underground because they're 45 years old and all that. And then one day, someone who was getting evicted because they hadn't paid rent crawled up on top of the leasing office, knocked out the skylights, and threw Molotov cocktails through them in an attempt to burn down the leasing office. They didn't burn it down, but they burned it out. So we had to redo that. And I remember, so one day walking through units, and again, shooting gunshots were common there. I was walking through a unit, and there's a hole in the drywall, and I pried out of it a spent bullet. And I kept that as a reminder that we will never, ever buy that kind of thing again. So what happened with it? We bought that. I think it was either late 2013 or early 2014. I think that was late 2013. And I don't know if you remember, but in 2015, everybody was dead certain a recession was coming in 2016. Kiyosaki even wrote a book about the 2016 crash, right? And so we said, at that point, we knew enough to say, all right, in a recession, the last kind of property you want to own is a rough C-class property, because C-class gets hit the hardest and falls the furthest and has the most delinquency when financial times get difficult. And so we said, you know what? Warren Buffett's number one rule, never lose money. We're just going to, let your winners ride, cut your losers short. We said, we're just going to get out of this while the getting's good. We sold it 2.5 years early. Our pro forma was 5 years. We said, we're going to get out just after 2 years. We got an offer that let us return 100% of capital, and it was like a 6 or 7% IRR or something like that. And that's the worst deal we've ever done. And we again learned a ton. Like, we really stepped back and analyzed everything. Like, okay, what went wrong? What went right? What are we never going to do again? And from that deal forward, Jim, is what you said earlier is, has it all been gravy since then? After that deal, basically, yes. We finally learned like what to do and what not to do. Thankfully, again, like we've never lost investor money on a syndication or anything like that. But that was a rough one, and we learned a whole lot.
Yeah, that's those C-class properties. They look, the numbers, like you said, in Excel, it looks fantastic, right? That you can't lose. But it's the constant renovations. Every time someone moves out, they kick in a door, this or that. And those properties, I learned from experience. That's why I'm not a syndicator or a active property investor anymore. I just do the passive stuff because, I just wasn't good at managing those C-class properties. And I didn't think of upgrading to B-class. I just said, I'll let someone else manage my assets for me. So that's what I do now. So what are some of you have LP investors, right? You have people investing in these projects. So what are some of the most common mistakes you see those LP investors making, either when they're investing with you or you see some of the other investments they've made?
There's a lot. I would say one of the most common, and I think people are starting to make this realization a little more now, but I would see this a lot the last few years of someone would just be looking at, I don't know, let's say 3 or 4 LP investment syndication opportunities. And let's just, compare, apples and oranges there. Let's just say 4 different apartment syndications. And they'd just be like, well, this one has the highest IRR. I'm going to invest in this one. Well, any sponsor of any kind of syndication can either unintentionally or intentionally very easily manipulate the numbers to put on a spreadsheet or to put on a pro forma. IRR in particular, or even AAR, all someone has to do, again, either just not knowing any better or intentionally as well, this isn't quite meeting our targets. So, hey, if I lower the exit cap rate 50 basis points, boom, this thing looks like a great deal. And so number one, big mistake is shopping just based on IRR. And then let's assume that you're looking at 4 different investments and all 4 of them are by great operators. They're honest, they're trustworthy, they really are trying to do a good job. But also, it seems like a lot of people that I talk to don't understand the correlations that are often present between risk and return. That if two, let's take 2 apartment opportunities or syndications, and one says, all right, well, this is a 14% IRR. Well, this one's a 17.5. Okay, clearly the 17.5 is better. Maybe. What are the risks that are being taken to achieve that higher return? Is it a huge renovation? Is it maybe that higher one, is it at 80% leverage while the other one's at 55% leverage, right? So if the market turns, which one has a higher risk of loss? Is there the one that has the higher IRR? Maybe there's a mezzanine debt piece on there, or even a preferred equity piece, which many investors don't realize. If you're an LP, that is ahead of you, and effectively, as far as you're concerned, it's debt because it gets paid off before you do. So yeah, their underlying loan might be 65%. But if they put 20% preferred equity on there, it's 85% leveraged as far as you as an LP is concerned. And what that does is it drives up the internal rate of return and makes it look even better than, it makes the return look great especially without explaining the risk. So I think that's one of the biggest mistakes people make. And it's understandable, right? Most investors have their own successful business or they're successful doctors, and they barely have time as it is. But if you're handing someone $100,000 or whatever that is, those are some key things to understand: is what risks are being taken in order to achieve the returns that are being projected. Because every sponsor and their mother gets on podcasts and say they underwrite conservatively. Clearly, some of them aren't. So that means either they're lying or just don't know any better. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they don't know any better. But yeah, those are, I could go on and on and on. So I'll stop there for now.
No, that was great. I would like clarification on a couple of things. You mentioned AAR and IRR. Can you explain what those are and the difference? And also mezzanine debt was another one that maybe you could explain out a little bit.
Yes. IRR is internal rate of return. What that does is it's actually kind of a complicated calculus-based function, but it takes if you invest $100,000 and you get $5,000 a year for 5 years, your cash on cash returns 5% for each of 5 years. What IRR does is it says, well, it factors in the timing of those payments and basically says, well, the earlier you get those payments, the more valuable they are because money is worth more today than it is in the future. So that's kind of why IRR is the gold standard, because it lets you compare investments of almost any kind. And it factors in the fact that, $10,000 today is worth more than $10,000 in the future. So that's IRR. Average annual return ignores timing. So you could, let's say you've got a great investment. You invest $100,000. 5 years later, you get nothing for 5 years. And then 5 years later, it sells and you get $200,000 back. So your original 100 plus 100 in profit. Your average annual return is going to be 20%, right? It's 100% divided by 5. The internal rate of return, if you actually calculate it, is probably going to be somewhere in the 14 to 16% range. And that's another mistake too, and I have a lot of sponsors these days. I apologize, this is a little bit one of my pet peeves. So I'll get off my soapbox quick, but I've seen a trend lately of sponsors only advertising AAR. Well, why is that? Well, because AAR is the easiest number to make look good, because it doesn't factor in timing. So if you're a sponsor, you should be looking for all the 4 key metrics: AAR, IRR, annual cash on cash, and equity multiple. Equity multiple is, well, if I put in $1, do I get 1.5 back, or 2 back, or 2.5? All 4 of those, none of them are bad. It's not bad to say, oh, this has a good AAR. You just have to look at all 4 to truly understand the full nature of the investment. You should never analyze just based on one. And it also depends on your goals and your business model. You might not care about annual cash flow. So you might just say, hey, I want AAR and I want equity multiple. And someone else could be the opposite. So mezzanine debt, that is when you go to typically an institution or a fund and you say, hey, I'm getting a bank loan for 60% LTV. I don't want to bring 40% equity, or I can't, or whatever reason. And they give you, it's a second, kind of the correlation is almost like getting a second mortgage on your house. So it's a piece of debt that sits on top of the primary loan, carries a much higher interest rate, and most importantly, comes with hooks. Meaning if the operator can't make the property hit certain targets and parameters, so if they don't get their net operating income high enough, if their debt service coverage ratio is not high enough, meaning there's, take the income divided by the mortgage, is there enough to pay the mortgage and have some left over? Then in many cases, those mezzanine debt people can come over and take over the deal. And if that happens, LP equity gone. And they also get paid first. So again, not saying mezzanine debt is necessarily bad or run away from anything that has it. Just make sure that you understand how it affects the mechanics of the deal.
Those are great explanations, and I appreciate that. I do want to get you back on your soapbox for just a minute and ask you what preferred returns, right? Those aren't always in the LP investor's best interest. Why is that?
They aren't. And I think this is actually probably one of the more pervasive myths in the syndication world in general. Essentially, what a preferred return, and to define it real quick, preferred return is basically saying, okay, the first X percent of profits or returns has to go to LP investors before the sponsor can get anything, right? So let's just say 8%, since that's a common number. One of the many things that does is it incentivizes the sponsor to do things that may or may not be in the best interest of the deal as a whole or the investors as a whole in order to achieve a higher IRR to get over the preferred return. And I'll give some examples. So when we mentioned IRR factors in the time value of money. So I've seen many situations where a sponsor will either sell a deal early, because the quicker you sell it, the higher the IRR, in order to achieve a really high IRR, because the money came back quickly. And so they easily clear the hurdle. Well, they can get paid faster and they can get paid more. But if they had just held on for 2 or 3 years more, or a little bit longer, the investor would have made almost double their money by holding that little bit longer period. So that's one. I've also seen situations where a sponsor will do a bad refinance because, again, they can return some extra capital. They'll and jack up the IRR and clear the hurdle, or it is in preferred returns encourage over leveraging, because the higher you leverage the property and reduce that LP position, the higher the IRR. So these are all things that the preferred return encourages the sponsor to do that are actually add risk to the LP position. Another one is, this is actually, the last few years, this just didn't really seem to matter that much, but it's becoming really important now. And unfortunately, probably some of the left field investors are in deals where distributions have stopped or they're doing capital calls, right? Well, if there's not enough money to clear the preferred return, now your sponsor is working for free. And if you've got a good sponsor who truly puts their investors first, they're still going to say, well, that's just, I know what, I knew that going in. I took the risk. I'm still going to do everything I can for those investors. But even a really good sponsor who that's their intention, if they have too many deals where that sponsor is earning $0, do you want somebody who's not making any income by running your investments? How focused are they going to be able to be running your investment if they are having to go become an Uber driver just to pay the bills, or they have to go do deals they shouldn't be doing so they can earn an acquisition fee so they can survive for another 6 months? Those are just some of the ways that it can set up a negative dynamic. In a big bull market like we had for the last 8 to 10 years, it works out fine. But when things shift like they have, it actually causes LPs and sponsors to have some conflicting interests.
So you mentioned, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but I kind of want to at least step into them. You mentioned the IRR and preferred return and how they're related, right? That if you have a preferred return, you're incentivized to boost the IRR by getting out of the deal quickly. How does the preferred return do that? What is a preferred return that it causes someone to behave differently on as regards the IRR and trying to boost it? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. So let's say a property is set up with an 8% preferred return, and the sponsor it's chugging along and it's producing 8% a year distributions, right? Which these days is not too bad, especially on a newer acquisition. Well, the sponsor or many sponsors are sitting there going, wait a second, I'm doing a great job. This thing's distributing 8%. I'm getting paid nothing. And in reality, for the investors, one of the biggest wealth creation aspects of real estate is holding it long term. We've sold properties that we held 7 or 8 years for 4 and 5x multiples because we held them longer. With the IRR, as actually, I guess it was still in the 20s, but not the best. But again, that was bull market. So what happens is if a sponsor's got a deal that's, let's say again, just making enough to pay that 8% preferred return, and so the sponsor is not making anything, then what a sponsor can be incentivized to do, and again, hopefully a good sponsor wouldn't do this, but it's called, we're talking about conflicting incentives. A sponsor would be like, okay, well, I can hold this we're 2 years in, I'm making everybody 8%, I'm making 0. I can hold this for 3, 4, 5 more years, continue to pay everyone 8% or maybe, 10%, hopefully down the road if it keeps going well. And then someday I get paid 5 years if things don't change. Or if I sell right now, 2 years in, I sell for a profit, the IRR goes to 27, and as the sponsor, my carve-out kicks in, and I get the majority of the profits from this thing. And investors, okay, they came out with a 1.4x multiple, where if it had held for 5 or 6 years, they might have gotten 3 or 4 times their money instead. So that's one of the ways a preferred return sounds great up front, but it can actually kind of backfire in the big picture. And then one final thing too is and definitely not all, but there's some folks out there that approach the sponsor as almost an adversary. Like, I'm giving you my money and you better pay me first. If that's your mentality, you're probably in the wrong business, because whatever sponsor you're investing with, they are your partner for the next 3 years or 5 years or whatever the length of it is. And you should not invest with anybody that you have any sense of adversarial relationship. You want to be, I say, you are literally business partners, and you want to have strong channels of communication and goodwill. And part of doing that is making sure that both of your interests are truly aligned, and that when one succeeds, both succeed.
Yeah, that's well said, and that's a good explanation. And it, part of the incentive too for these sponsors is if you get out quick and have a high IRR, the returns might not be as good, but they look good when you're then saying, hey, look at my historical performance. I have all these IRRs in the 20s and 30s. So that's a great explanation. I want to pivot real quick and talk about the current environment, right? Everyone knows interest rates went through the roof really quickly, and insurance rates have gone up. So how does that affect your business, the current properties you own, and perhaps ones that you're either thinking of selling or thinking of buying? What has the impact been?
It's been very significant, as I'm sure all your audience knows. In terms of our current portfolio, it's actually had very little impact. The reason being, we currently manage about 1,500 units because, like I said, we've sold off roughly 1,200. However, starting in about, I think it was 2018, 2019, when everyone was kind of moving towards floating rate loans in order to make deals work, we kind of took a different approach. And we said, well, we are at the lowest interest rates in history. And we've been on a 40-year bond market bull run, which means interest rates have basically been coming down for 40 years. And we said, all right, statistically speaking, if we are at the lowest interest rates in history, the odds of rates being higher down the road are greater than the odds of rates being lower down the road. And so we did the opposite, and we fixed everything. And because that we have fixed rate debt on our properties, we're fine. Our mortgage payments haven't changed, except for one asset that we purchased October of 21. We had to get a bridge loan because there was a new construction element to it, and agencies won't lend on that. But fortunately, we got we negotiated a 3-year term with a cap, and so that property, the interest payments on that one did go up. And as soon as we saw this coming, a year or so ago, we said, we apologize, everybody. The property is doing great. It's actually like ahead of pro forma, but we have to pause distributions and build up reserves because we don't know where this is going to go in a year and a half. So that property, our mortgage payments have gone up significantly. It does still cash flow. It doesn't need, we don't need to feed it any money. We've got about another year plus to work out an exit. Right now, if we had to do something today, we would either do a little bit of cash in refinance, or because of our value add, we just had a broker opinion of value done on it. It is worth significantly more than we paid for it because we got such a good deal on it. So our worst case is we sell early and have a small return. That's the only one that this current environment's affected us. The rest of the portfolio is doing fine because we fixed it. And then again, getting back to preferred returns, we stopped doing those a few years ago when we kind of realized, like, wait, this actually isn't a good thing. The cash flow that we're sharing on those in the current portfolio is part of what lets us pay all of our bills, pay all of our expenses, keep our team employed, and then just only do deals when we should, not just because we can. And we've done one deal this year, and that's it because we can't find anything. So that gets into how has it affected the market in general and acquisitions. We are generally 15 to 20% below what the seller is looking for when we make an offer. If they're asking for 20 million, we might be offering 16 because we're looking at the current debt. We're factoring, well, what if cap rates go up even further? That significantly impacts the exit. And so, there's a huge gap in what we can offer and what sellers are looking for. And that's not just us. That's the majority of the market. Volume right now is 25% of what it used to be. And I do think that's going to dramatically change in the near future. I think it's going to start picking up in October, November, and then really pick up next year. And man, for anyone who's felt like they missed this last cycle or missed this big bull run, I think 24 and 25 is going to be the opportunity to get in for the next big cycle. There's going to be some really good opportunities. Long-term fundamentals for multifamily are still solid, and there's going to be another upcycle once we get through this, and we're gearing up to take advantage of it. So.
That's great. And I want to end on a positive note that 24, 25, 26, things are going to get better. So we appreciate that. The last question I always ask is, what is a great podcast that you listen to that you'd like to share with our community?
One of my favorite ones is called Macro Voices, and it focuses on macroeconomic issues, and not just even the United States. A lot of times they're talking about worldwide, and I don't think in the couple of years I've listened to them, I don't know if they've even barely mentioned real estate, and definitely not multifamily. However, our apartments or whatever, self-storage, whatever you're investing in, it is like our investments are real estate are like a canoe in a giant river. In that river, that current is the overall economic climate. And so that's one of the reasons I try to stay abreast of the macro picture, to try to have a good idea of where the overall current is going, so that we can position ourselves within that to take best advantage of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'll definitely check that one out. We'll put that in the show notes. So if listeners want to get in touch with you, learn more about Vantage Point Acquisitions, what's the best way to do that?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn these days. I am not a Instagram, TikTok dancer or anything like that, but I do post on LinkedIn. And if you comment, I do personally reply to that. So yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn, and then our website. If you Google Vantage Point Acquisitions or Andrew Cushman, I'm told I somehow have good SEO. I don't know how that happened, but thankfully I do. So it's always the top 2 pages of results. But if you go to the website, vpacq.com, there's a connect with us tab on there, and you can schedule a phone call through there. And love to meet some of the left field investors. So.
Perfect. We'll put that in the show notes. Thank you for your time today, Andrew. This has been fascinating. We really appreciate you being on the show.
All right. Good talking to you, Jim. Take care.
That was a fun podcast, just talking to Andrew. There were a lot of really good nuggets that I got out of that. His superpower, he says, is relentless persistence. And, who doesn't want that in someone that they're giving their money to, that they're just going to relentlessly persist and get the deals done in a positive way. So that's great. And he showed that, right? When he's getting into flipping houses and he made 4,500 plus calls before he was successful, but he knew that others had success at this. So he stuck to it. And look what happened. He had a successful flipping business that turned into a successful syndication business. And, he talked also, I love this, about R&D. For real estate, it's rip off and duplicate. And I love that, because there's so much in real estate that you don't really have competitors. Even the operators, they're competitors, but they also work together. They also steal each other's ideas in a good way and duplicate them. And that's what we do at Left Field Investors as well. If I find someone that's doing something cool or exciting or just great, I'm going to ask them, hey, tell me how to do that. I'm going to rip it off and duplicate. So that's my R&D. Love that. I also like an operator who is willing to talk about his worst deal. In fact, when I was reaching out to him and I said, hey, what are some things you want to talk about? He said, I'd like to talk about my worst deal. And that just shows you that he's willing to learn, adapt, and understand what he's doing. So that's fantastic. The preferred return conversation was super interesting, because he's right. It does incentivize operators to sell earlier than they otherwise would. And throughout this long bull market we've had, people were flipping properties, flipping multifamilies in 2-3 years. And he's saying, hey, hold it a little bit longer and you'll be better off at the end. So that's not always the case, but that is sometimes the case. And so you just have to do it on a, case by case basis. And then Andrew is so forward thinking, right? He switched to multifamily because he did an analysis and said, we're coming out of a recession. Multifamily is going to boom. And he was right. And then, 2018-19, he said, lowest interest rates we've had forever. They have to go up. So he switched to fixed rate debt. Both of those were they paid off, right? He predicted where things were going. And now he's saying multifamily is going to boom in 25 and 26. Is he right? I don't know. We'll find out. But he's had some right calls in the past. So that might be something to look out for. So I had a great time talking to him and found out he's a skier. So offline, we had a nice conversation too. So really looking forward to get to know Andrew better. That's all we have for this time. We'll catch you next time in the left field.